My name's David Mercer. I'm 39, and up until last December, I thought I understood the rules of my life. Work hard, keep your head down, and trust the person you come home to. It's strange how quickly that kind of certainty can vanish. I live in Chicago, or at least I used to call it living. I run a mid-sized construction management firm, the kind that fixes other people's mistakes for a living. Long hours, constant noise, constant pressure, but it paid well enough. I was proud of that. My wife, Lauren, used to joke that I loved my job more than I loved her. She wasn't wrong, at least not at first. We'd been married 12 years. No kids, by choice, or at least that's what she always said when people asked. She handled the money, I handled the schedule, and we both handled the illusion that everything was fine. Until the illusion started cracking. It began with the phone. She'd started keeping it face down. Nothing unusual at first, just a habit. But then she changed her passcode. She started leaving the room to take calls. Little things, small things, but small things add up. One night, she got a text while we were eating. Her face changed, that half-second flicker before she forced a smile. I didn't ask then, but I should have. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't start with the act. It starts with a silence you convince yourself not to question. I tried to ignore it for weeks. I buried myself in work. Late nights on site, fake overtime, anything to avoid coming home to that cold, polite version of her. But no matter how much I avoided it, the truth was waiting. The breaking point came in February. We were supposed to go to her mother's birthday dinner. Small, quiet, just family. I came home early to change, and that's when I saw it. Her laptop open on the kitchen counter, a document half written, a message notification glowing in the corner. I shouldn't have looked. I know that, but I did. The message read, "He's suspicious. I'll handle it." And it wasn't the message that broke me. It was the name under it. Mark Delaney. He was one of my clients, a man I'd known for 6 years. Married, 2 kids, played golf every Sunday. I'd had beers with him, trusted him, and my wife was handling me for him. For a few minutes, I couldn't move. Just stood there, staring at her laptop, reading their thread. Dozens of messages, codes, times, places. They talked about meetings like they were business deals, except these meetings happened in hotels, not offices. The last message hit harder than the rest. "He'll be gone all weekend for the bid review. We'll have the house to ourselves." The weekend before Valentine's Day, the same weekend I'd been out of town. I sat down, still holding her laptop, and realized I was shaking. Not crying, not angry yet, just shaking. Like my body couldn't decide what emotion fit. When she came home an hour later, I'd already decided not to say a word. Not yet. People think revenge is an explosion. It's not. It's a slow leak. You feel it drain out of you, the love, the trust, the decency. And when it's gone, you're left with something cold, something efficient. I started documenting everything. The messages, the calls, the calendar entries she thought she deleted. I hired a guy, a quiet ex-cop named Ryan Keller, to follow her. No questions asked. He was good, discreet. 2 days later, he had photos. Her and Mark. Downtown. Same cafe, same booth, same lie. Ryan dropped the folder on my desk and said, "You sure you want to see all this?" I said, "I already have." But it wasn't just about the affair. Not anymore. The photos showed something else, something that didn't fit. Mark was giving her a folder in one of the shots. Another had them shaking hands, not like lovers but like partners. That's what got me thinking. Lauren wasn't stupid. She knew better than to risk everything just for an affair. So what else was she getting out of it? Ryan did some digging. Turns out, Mark's company, Delaney Infrastructure, had been under quiet investigation for embezzlement. Millions missing from government contracts. And guess who managed the construction accounts for his last 3 projects? My firm. That night, I drove to the site of our latest project, an office complex half finished, half funded, and barely holding together. I sat there in the dark cab of my truck, the hum of the generator echoing through the steel frame. I started seeing it all differently. Her affair wasn't a coincidence. It was a connection. She wasn't cheating for love. She was covering something up. And if she was helping him move money through my company's contracts, then she wasn't just betraying me. She was setting me up to take the fall. I went home at 2 a.m. The house was silent, the kind of silence that listens back. Lauren was asleep, curled up on her side, like nothing had happened. I stood in the doorway watching her breathe and felt something inside me shut off completely. I used to think there was a line between right and wrong, between love and hate, but that night looking at her, at the woman who smiled at me every morning while dismantling my life piece by piece, I realized there's no line, just timing, and hers had finally run out. When I woke the next morning, the world felt quieter, not peaceful, never that, but muffled, like I was hearing everything through water. Lauren was already gone, her side of the bed cold, the smell of her perfume lingering in the air. She'd left a note on the counter. Gone to the gym early. Don't forget your 10 a.m. call with the city rep. Love you, love you. 2 words she wrote automatically, like sending a receipt. I folded the note and put it in my pocket. Evidence comes in all forms. And I was learning fast that even the smallest pieces matter when you're building a case, especially when the person you're building it against shares your house and your last name. Ryan met me in my office that afternoon. He slid another folder across the table, this one thicker. You were right, he said. Your wife isn't just sleeping with Delaney. She is on his payroll. He opened the folder to show me a set of bank statements. 3 accounts. 2 in her name, 1 in a shell company registered in Delaware. Transfers from Delaney Infrastructure every few weeks. Amounts that looked random but weren't. She's moving money, Ryan said. Not much each time, but steady. Someone's trying to keep it under radar. My throat went dry. How much total? About 200 grand over the past year. I stared at the numbers. It wasn't about love. It never had been. It was business. Calculated, careful, professional betrayal. That night, I searched our home office. Lauren kept everything to neat, to perfect, but perfection leaves gaps if you know where to look. Her files were locked, her laptop passworded, but her habits were predictable. She liked to keep backups just in case. USB drives tucked in drawers. Old hard drives in boxes in the back of a filing cabinet. Behind an old stack of tax forms, I found a small external drive labeled LJ Personal. Plugging it into my laptop, I felt my pulse in my throat. There were spreadsheets, invoices, wire transfers, and tucked among them, a folder called Site Logs, Delaney West Loop, one of our company's biggest projects. Inside were doctored reports, false material costs, inflated labor hours, phony inspection signatures. It was all there, and every single fraudulent document had my digital signature at the bottom. She hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She was framing me financially. I remember sitting there in the dark, the monitor's light flickering off my hands. My marriage wasn't just dying. It was a weapon aimed directly at me. The phone buzzed beside me. A message from Lauren. Running late. Don't wait up. Dinner with Sarah, her best friend. Except Ryan had told me earlier she met Delaney every Thursday night. I texted back, no problem. Be safe. Then I called Ryan. Follow her again, I said. But this time, I want audio. Get me everything. He hesitated. You sure you want to hear it? I said, no, but I need to. At 11:42 p.m., he sent me the first clip. Their voices were low, muffled by bar noise. Lauren's laugh cut through, so familiar, so fake now that I could barely stand to hear it. Then Delaney's voice. It's fine. Once the audit's done, he'll take the hit. You'll just need to play dumb. You're good at that, Lauren. And if he finds out before then? Delaney, he won't. He trusts you too much. That's his weakness. I rewound that part 3 times. He trusts you too much. The irony made me smile. Not a happy smile, a sharp, hollow one. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing like I was building a machine, systematic, quiet, invisible. Step 1. Move my own money out of shared accounts. Step 2. Back up every file on her drive, twice. Step 3. Trace every payment between Delaney Infrastructure and my company. It wasn't hard once I knew where to look. She'd left digital fingerprints everywhere. She was good, but she wasn't meticulous. Not like me. Every night, while she slept a few feet away, I sat at my desk and cataloged her lies. The numbers, the calls, the meeting logs, all of it leading to one conclusion. She wasn't working for Delaney. She was working with him. Together, they'd siphoned nearly $3 million in fake project costs. Money washed through consulting fees, hidden in invoices, routed offshore. And my signature was the trailhead. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I started playing the long game. When she asked about my day, I smiled. When she kissed my cheek, I let her. When she said I love you, I said it back, with a calmness that even I didn't believe. The more she lied, the more I planned. The first part of revenge isn't anger, it's discipline. You can't hit what you can't see, and she had no idea I'd already begun dismantling her entire foundation. 2 weeks later, I met Ryan again. He handed me a small flash drive. You might want to sit for this. On the drive was a video. Lauren and Delaney again, only this time, they weren't alone. They were meeting with a man I didn't recognize. Slick suit, older, expensive watch. Ryan zoomed in on his face. Who's that? I asked. Name's Victor Keane, Ryan said. Corporate attorney. Big money guy. Handles offshore setups for a lot of companies in the city. What's he doing with them? Setting up something new, looks like. He mentioned phase 2. I couldn't get all the audio. I leaned back, letting that sink in. If there was a phase 2, it meant the scheme wasn't finished, which meant they were still exposed. And if they were exposed, I had time. Time to make sure they'd destroy themselves. That night, I drove home and sat in my truck outside the house for nearly an hour. The lights were on in the kitchen. I could see her silhouette through the window, pouring wine, humming softly. She looked peaceful. She looked innocent. And that's when I realized something terrifying. I didn't want her gone yet. Not until she felt what I felt. Not until she knew what it was like to be trapped in a life built on lies. There's a kind of silence that follows a man who's decided to be methodical. It's not empty. It's full of preparations, lists, contingency plans, little rituals that make you feel like a chess player instead of a wreck. I slept less. I learned rhythms. I measured the timing of everything so precisely that even my breathing felt scheduled. The first rule I gave myself was simple. Don't act from passion. When you move out of anger, you leave fingerprints. When you move from calculation, you leave traces that look like accidents. I had a file of photographs, audio clips, bank statements, and doctored invoices. I also had patience. That combination is dangerous in the same way a loaded gun in careful hands is dangerous. I started small because small things find cracks in systems built on confidence. I needed Delaney to think the money trail was secure and Lauren to think I was still asleep. Both assumptions were useful. So I staged a few things that would look like mistakes: a misfiled ledger, a bank transfer query accidentally CC'd to the wrong email, a printed invoice left on a copier at a public print shop. Little errors that didn't scream sabotage, but would make men check their corners. One of my earliest moves was to test Kane. I sent an anonymous email from a throwaway address to a mid-level paralegal at Kane's firm. The message contained a tiny seed, a scanned invoice with one line item circled, and a note that said, "Confirm origin." That was all. I sat back and watched. Within 48 hours, the paralegal forwarded the note up the chain with the kind of urgency that turns paper into panic. Kane called Delaney. Delaney called Lauren. Her voice, the one I'd once thought was the sound of my life, trembled when she said his name. I didn't want to savor the moment so much as verify how brittle they were. They were brittle. Their networks were built like casinos. Impressive lights, lots of sound, and a few secret doors you only used when you trusted somebody else not to look. By nudging at the wrong email chain, I made them look. I fed information in 4 lanes so no single path could be closed off. One lane went to an ethics reporter I'd once helped with a background check years ago. Now a man who owes me one favor and likes doing the right thing enough to risk his career. Another lane was to a federal procurement analyst who tracked unusual billing in municipal projects. A third lane leaked to a compliance officer at Delaney Infrastructure from an anonymous tip. The final lane was the slowest, a tax audit request filed anonymously with state officials. When all 4 lanes pulled at the same string, the room under the table started to rattle. But before the system could react, I needed internal cracks. People who have been bought are insecure about the furniture they sit on. Fear is the solvent that loosens glue. I didn't need to threaten anyone directly. I needed them to see that their safe options were evaporating. So I built a small empire of discomfort. Late-night calls with questions that hinted at audits. A printed ledger left on a park bench that found its way into the hands of a temp who worked at Delaney's headquarters. A voicemail with a shaky voice claiming that a junior accountant had evidence and wanted a whistleblower's protection. It worked like a charm. Petty paranoia is faster than courage. A manager asked for a reconciliation meeting. A client demanded confirmations. A vendor was suddenly on hold while auditors rechecked invoices. One by one, their quiet compadres began to ask painful questions in polite rooms they used to own. The toughest part was Lauren. I could set the world spinning, but she had to show the strain for the plan to create leverage. I had to make her feel small without making her cornered enough to run. That's why I didn't burn her immediately. I let the slow pressure do the work. A bank call she had to return in the middle of a dinner. A subpoena notice she had to forward to Mark with a shaky hand. A board member's worried text that arrived as she was in the shower. I wanted to watch her lose the composure she wore as armor. One night, after a long string of little collapses, I followed her and Delaney to a meeting at a private club near the river. Harris used to do that part for me, but I'd grown attached to the act of watching. From a shadowed booth, I filmed their interaction with a lens that picked up their body language better than the audio. Delaney was all controlled menace, reassuring, calculating, a man who believed nothing ever stuck to him. Lauren was quieter. Her hands trembled when she signed something on a napkin. When the check came, Delaney slipped an envelope across the table with the nonchalance of someone who pays for naps. Inside, a business card and a small USB. She put it in her purse and smiled at him like a woman watching a scene she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. He left with the same arrogance as always, certain the shore was secure. That night, I copied the USB. What I found was both larger and more mundane than I'd imagined. Spreadsheets with coded project IDs. A ledger of shell payments tied to the names of vendors long defunct. And a folder labeled Phase 2 Proposal with a list of properties slated to receive consultations, a euphemism for skinned profits. The file had a note with an attorney's email and the phrase, capitalized before audit. It was a line directing money into accounts, with short windows, the kind of thing that can disappear if you act faster than the paperwork. I sent a copy of that folder to the federal analyst and let it sit. I also encrypted another copy and uploaded it to an anonymous drop that published to a watchdog forum if it wasn't accessed in 72 hours. That 72-hour timer was my insurance. I'd made myself unavoidable. Delaney reacted within the window, of course. He called his contacts, pushed his influence, and tried to slap legal screens over the nascent inquiries. Kane made quiet threats. A man came to my office pretending to be a municipal inspector, asked questions about my contract oversight, and left with a smile. The pressure moved back toward me. It always does. The system's reflex is to protect itself by pushing the trouble outward. I expected that. I'd planned for it. I'd already transferred company funds into legal safe structures and left a paper trail that would implicate Delaney more than me. But the system's push also revealed something I hadn't counted on, a human mercy I didn't deserve. Ryan, the ex-cop, had been watching too much for too long. He'd taken risks he didn't need to take. One rainy dawn, he came to me and said, "I can't be the guy who follows a woman's footsteps anymore." He'd been threatened. His kids were bullied. He wanted out. I offered him money, safe houses, a plan to disappear. He refused. The man with the cigarettes walked away from the business we'd built together, leaving me with fewer hands and more responsibility. I felt the loss like a missing tooth. But I didn't stop. I found other helpers. A junior analyst at the municipal procurement office who liked to blow off steam at a karaoke bar and happened to hate corruption. A freelancer coder who owed me for a favor years ago. Small people, not heroic, but dependable when put in the right place. The network I built to dismantle a network was leaner, meaner, and more difficult to seed up to weeks after the USB. The wheels began to grind loud. Delaney's firm received an audit notice. Kane's firm instructed him to limit exposure. Senior partner at Halstead, that name I'd glimpsed in one of the ledgers and had brushed off as a phantom, quietly resigned from its board, ostensibly for personal reasons. The press began to ask questions not just about missing money but about partners, donations, and suspicious consultants. And Lauren, she called me that night in a voice that had a new edge. "Who did you talk to?" she asked. Not accusing, I'd made sure the initial leaks looked like internal whistleblowing, but afraid. Fear has a sound. It's small, quick breaths between syllables. "Who told you?" I asked. Her silence was the answer. She started to cry without knowing why. "Everything's collapsing," she said. "They're saying my name on calls. Do you want to tell them the truth?" I asked. "I can't." Her voice was so thin I almost believed she meant it. "You still can," I said. It was not a plea. It was a notice. You can sign a statement. You can tell the investigators everything. Or you can keep playing a role in Act Two and hope the stage doesn't fall. She hung up. I watched the phone light die and felt nothing for a long time. There's a moment in every plan when the cost of going on is measured in non-recoverable things. Friends you lose, reputations you burn, sleep you no longer own. I had already paid a lot, and the ledger kept growing. But I had also started to see the shape of the outcome. Delaney's contacts, exposed. Kane's safe houses, compromised. Halstead's small vices, now scrutinized under a legal microscope. Each pressure point I'd placed had a corresponding pressure back at me. That was the rule I'd set for myself. If you poke the hive, you must accept the stings. The night I thought they might strike back in force, I got a message from an unknown number. Just one line. "Meet me at the pier. Midnight. Come alone." No name. No threats. Nothing. The kind of note that feels like a promise. I almost didn't go. The rational thing would be to call the investigator I trusted, the one tied to the federal analyst, and let them arrange for protection. But I'd been following people long enough to know what meetings at midnight on the pier usually meant. Deals, threats, or both. I needed to see who wanted to speak as much as they needed to see that I would show. They don't come at you all at once. The system moves in polite little increments. A phone call that sounds like concern, a lawyer who wants to help, a vendor who suddenly needs to rate check past invoices. Each small thing is a pressure point. Individually they're manageable. Together they are a vice. After the pier and the conversation with Kane, it became obvious. This wasn't just Delaney and Lauren. There were people who kept things tidy for men like him, lawyers, accountants, procurement officers, people who resealed seams after others cut them, people who made problems go away quietly, legally, expensively. The first few days after Kane's warning were busy in the kind of way that feels like survival training. My inbox filled with veiled threats, emails that used diplomatic language, but had undertones sharp enough to cut. A man in a suit came to the site claiming to represent a client and asked questions about billing cycles, subcontractor rates, material sources, questions designed to make our estimates look sloppy. Another time, a county inspector showed up unexpectedly, clipboard in hand, and spent 3 hours making notes about things that had been fine a month earlier. It's funny how compliance suddenly becomes a hobby when someone wants a headache. I kept my head down and my ledger open. The work I'd done, leaks, anonymous tips, the timed releases, had achieved its first aim. People were asking the right questions. But the network's response was already moving past questions to containment. They started to push back where it would hurt. Leverage. Leverage isn't always money. It's children's scholarships. It's a threatened audit that would tie up a small ministry's grant. It's an anonymous complaint to a regulatory board about irregularities in your company's safety record. The engine of that pressure is rarely visible until it's too late. I watched as my life's ordinary infrastructure clients, local permits, even friendships began to fray. Ryan quit. Harris, the man I'd first talked to, had long since disappeared, but Ryan had been my linchpin. He'd followed Lauren, taken risks, and had skin in the game. The night he told me he couldn't watch anymore, there was a tremble in his voice I recognized, fear prefaced by guilt. He left town with the money I'd arranged, and a false name. That absence carved a gap I had to fill. So I recruited differently. I didn't want muscle. I wanted minds that could vanish into bureaucracy and come out with answers. I found a woman in procurement, a temp who had access to invoice archives and a small, consistent resentment against the managers who hired her. I found a junior accountant in Delaney's firm who liked the idea of ethics more than a paycheck, and a coder who owed me for a background check I'd done years ago, and who could rig metadata so a file looked like it had been created earlier than it was. Small people, not heroic, reliable. With those people, we began the slow tooth gnaw of the network. The procurement temp dug through invoice batches and found one that matched a show vendor's routing number to Delaney's consulting account. The junior accountant gave me copies of signed receipts that had never been delivered. The coder created a small, plausible alternate trail that allowed us to test reactions. We pushed on many fronts at once. A carefully crafted tip went to the municipal procurement analyst. An anonymous packet landed on the desk of a reporter we'd primed months earlier. A curated file was slipped into the inbox of a compliance officer at a bank that had handled one of Delaney's transfers. The idea was not to prove everything in one go, but to force the network to use their machinery. When they moved to contain one leak, they exposed themselves elsewhere. The first big crack came 3 weeks later. A middle manager at Delaney's firm, one of the quieter men who signed off on invoices, got nervous. He'd seen the temp's note and a reporter's query in the same morning. He panicked and asked for an internal reconciliation. He didn't call the lawyers. He called a meeting that included people from accounting, procurement, and, crucially, someone from risk management who had a history of being squeamish about gray areas. Once Risk looked at the files, they didn't like what they saw. Risk likes paper, and when paper is messy, people get nervous. Once someone internal says the word reconcile, the dominoes start to fall. Delaney started making mistakes. He double-paid a subcontractor the next week by accident, a sloppy transfer that left a trail. Kane's legal deputy began pulling documents and finding inconsistencies. Small things, but the network couldn't fix everything at once without drawing attention. That's when the retaliation escalated. They stopped being subtle. My company's line items were questioned in a forum where one of our clients sat as the board member who could influence ongoing bids. An old complaint about minor safety violations resurfaced and became an investigation. I lost a potential subcontractor after their procurement head got a call from an unfamiliar number and decided, sensibly for them, to avoid entanglement. Then the violence began. Not direct at first, more like signals. One night, someone keyed the driver's side door of my truck. Another morning there was a pile of flyers outside my door accusing our firm of fraudulent billing practices. The local paper ran a small, anonymous op-ed questioning the ethics of contractors involved in public projects. Someone burned a pile of company documents in the alley behind the office, probably a message. Think twice. And the worst part was the targeting of people around me. The procurement temp found a note slipped under her door. Tell us to stop, or your sister loses the scholarship. She cried and quit. The junior accountant's father lost a small pension when a client withdrew funds at the hint of scandal. People I'd recruited became collateral bargaining chips, and the network used everything it had. I began to understand the scale of what I'd opened. I wanted them undone. I wanted the truth to be expensive for them. But they wanted me silenced. And silence, in that world, is sometimes enforced violently. So I changed tactics. Instead of pushing only on the financial seams, I pushed into reputation, into those things the network valued most. Kane had a private life. He went to a certain club on Thursdays. Delaney had a pattern of charity donations routed through names that barely existed. I fed that into channels that punished optics, nonprofit boards, prestigious event organizers, people who cared about appearances. It was ugly. Call it exposure as weapon. But my arsenal was mostly public truth documents, timestamps, witnesses. That made the attacks less legally actionable and yet socially corrosive. At the same time I worked on my own insulation. I started meeting with the lead investigator from the Federal Procurement Office. I recorded interviews and put copies in secure drives scattered across services and jurisdictions that couldn't easily be subpoenaed together. I hired a lawyer who'd once cleared a whistleblower and liked the idea of doing it again. Your defense is as good as the ground you build under it. I widened the base, and still, guilt seeped in like damp. I saw Lauren once in the grocery store, her hair in a messy bun, mascara running, pulling a cart with 2 bags, and the same hollow eyes she'd always managed to hide behind. She saw me and looked away. There was no recrimination, no plea, only exhaustion. Part of me wanted to drag her into the center of everything, make her feel every cut. Another, older part of me wanted to hold her and tell her we could stop. That part had been erased. The network's teeth were sharp and patient. They bit soft at first, then harder. A subpoena arrived for our company for unrelated contracts. A former crew chief who'd worked for me for a decade was called to testify about site logs he'd once signed off on. He was a man with a mortgage and kids. He looked at me with a plea I couldn't answer. I don't know what to say, he told me in the parking lot. I don't want to lose my house. The ledger of collateral expanded. By the time I sat in front of the federal investigator and laid out the documents phased to proposals, show payments, signed receipts, Delaney's voice on a recording saying he trusts you too much, I was exhausted. But something else had happened, too. The network's push had made mistakes. They'd relied on the presumed silence of people. They underestimated the ripple once someone decided to make the math visible. The investigator looked at the files, then at me. You realize what you've done? She asked. It wasn't a question about legality. It was about consequence. You've made enemies with resources. I know, I said. I also made sure there are witnesses and paper trails in 3 independent places. You can't erase them all. She nodded, not for comfort but for acknowledgement. We'll move. Carefully. Outside, the world kept getting sharper. There were more threat angles I wouldn't have imagined when I first found the messages on Lauren's laptop. There were also the first small victories. A vendor contract pulled for review, a bank asking questions, a quietly executed subpoena to an offshore account. The teeth of the network had started to break one another's teeth. But every gain had a cost. Allies left. Reputations were bruised. People I'd once relied on had been hurt. The system's immunity was not absolute. It was bought and maintained by other people's silence. When you cut that currency away, the reaction is blood. I learned to accept that the last part of this would be a reckoning not only for them, but for me. The network's head would not simply topple. It would claw. It would hurt others to stay intact. And if I wanted to finish what I'd started, I would have to be ready to lose the things that still kept me human. That's the shape of the night now as I write this. The ledger on my desk. The file copies in multiple safes. The names of men and women who can be called to testify. The next step is not another leak. It's the moment of confrontation, the legal, the public, the inevitable courtroom kind where everything can be tested and where the system's teeth either break or bite back. I sleep less. I listen more. I know a visit may come tonight or tomorrow with men who have nothing to lose. I also know I'm closer to the point where the entire thing might unravel. Tomorrow I meet with the federal prosecutor. I'll hand her the last set of evidence and watch how a lawful hammer falls. If it lands clean, people will go to prison and the money will be traced. If it falters, the network will rebuild with a different name and I'll be left with the ruin. Either way, the next chapter won't be about discovery or pressure. It will be about consequence. And the thing that scares me most is this. I don't know if I want them destroyed so they can't hurt others or if I want them destroyed so I can stop hearing the quiet that now lives in my chest. They told me once, in a briefing room that smelled of coffee and recycled breath, that systems are moth-eaten in the same place, not at the core, but at the seams. The seams are where people touch each other, the payroll clerk who wants to get home early, the junior associate who's tired of being used, the procurement officer who prefers a quiet life. That was always the system's mistake. It assumed the seams would hold because fear was a better glue than gratitude. The prosecutor looked at me across the conference table with the kind of measured softness you save for someone who has given you the hardest truth. We'll move, she said, but we do it right. We build cases that can't be wiggled out in appeals. We document everything. In the 48 hours that followed, documents were subpoenaed, servers mirrored, bank accounts frozen. The machine churned. Inertia became motion. It felt different watching it run with legal force behind it than it had when I was the one leaking for leverage. This was slower, scarcer. It involved human beings required to follow rules. That slowness was cruelty and mercy both. It kept reckless violence out of the immediate equation. But it also gave the network time to retaliate. They did. A car ran a red light into the side of Ryan's truck. He walked away with bruised ribs and a statement that the driver wasn't paying attention. The payroll temp received an anonymous letter with a list of bank transfers and names that could end her sister's scholarship. The junior accountant found his father's employment files quietly audited. His small-town employer received unexpected queries that made payroll erratic. The collateral cascade I'd always feared became real. I'd cut one vein and the contamination spread. When the indictments dropped, the press called it a high-profile procurement scandal. Kane's firm closed under legal pressure. Delaney Infrastructure declared bankruptcy with the kind of theatricalness that suggests a script, resignations, apologies. A PR team that scripted a mea culpa for a man who once called himself untouchable. Halstead, a name that had the weight of an oily ledger, spun itself into a regulatory nightmare, losing contracts and reputational assets faster than it could bribe its way out. Reed, the small-time fixer whose arrogance had started our thread, failed to get his deal stitched. He was the low-hanging fruit. Prosecutions are always easier for the man who thinks he's clever than he is. Kane and Delaney pleaded to reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. They named others. They dialed back decades of safe distance like men with stitches, willing to sacrifice a finger to save a hand, and Lauren, my wife, became, of all things, a key witness. I didn't expect that. I expected denials. I expected Stonewall, 100 lawsuits, and a cold architectural collapse of our life. Instead, she sat in a sterile room with a woman from the prosecutor's office and told the truth in a voice so flat I barely recognized it. She read admissions off a piece of paper. At first, Then she spoke without it. She told them about the first time Delaney had asked her to adjust an invoice, about the meetings, about Victor Kane's calm voice suggesting ways to sanitize accounts. She said things that hurt to hear, not because they implicated me, but because they showed how willingly she'd stepped into the role of participant. I did not watch the testimony live. I listened later in a recording the prosecutor gave me. There are things you cannot bear in the flesh, and things your ears can take. She sounded smaller in those files than she had at the kitchen table with the wine. It was not pity I felt. It was a strange, wrenching sympathy I did not know how to place. The trial season moved like weather. There were press conferences, and legal filings, and men whose faces I'd once known in a different light sitting behind glass. Some went to prison. Some vanished into consultations and overseas addresses with plea deal money stashed into accounts that made public atonement optional. The law clipped the network. It didn't sever it. Systems mutate. New names rose to take old roles. That was the part nobody in the headlines liked to say. You can prosecute men. You cannot undo the hunger that made them predators. My company survived. Barely. We lost contracts. We lost a few good workers who didn't want the hassle. A federal monitor drafted new compliance protocols that now sit on every project desk. Auditors with sharper teeth read our books. It was humiliating and, in an odd way, stabilizing. Order returned like a cautious tide. What came more quietly and more painfully was what the prosecutions did to people I loved. The junior accountant's father took early retirement after an audit revealed past irregularities. He cried once in my office and thanked me for being honest, and thanked me for how the truth had finally given him something to own, even as it cost him a pension. That sort of gratefulness is a raw exchange, a man losing bread but gaining a conscience. I didn't know whether to accept it. The temp who followed the files moved away with her sister to a different city. Ryan, after the accident, left town too. He said he'd had enough of the gray spaces between survival and legality. He sent me a postcard once, a bare beach and the words, "Found sunlight. Keep the ledger." He had the gall to be happy. It made my stomach ache. As for Lauren, she left the house with a duffel and a face like a map of weather. I drove her to the motel the prosecutor had set up, a bland place with bland curtains and bland coffee, the kind of anonymity that is legally merciful. We didn't talk much on the ride. The silence between us had changed shape. It was no longer waiting to be filled with accusations. It had been replaced by the practicality of moving. At the motel door she stopped and looked at me. For a crazy brief second she reached for my hand like the woman who might have once wanted to be saved. Then she withdrew and smiled sadly. "You were always too good at reading numbers," he said. "You never looked at the ledger that mattered." "What ledger?" I asked. "The one with our life," she said. "You write it down, you think you can balance it. You can't." She gestured at the town around us. "Nothing special. Go on, live." She left. And it was not the slamming of a door that follows anger. It was the soft closing of one that cannot bear light. Months later, I saw a photo in a legal filing, Lauren standing in a witness box, named as someone who'd cooperated. Her sentence was a suspended plea, community service, and a fine, terms piled onto legal paperwork but not stacked high enough to touch the rest of her life. That bargain was hers, and somehow it was what she wanted. Survival shaped around avoidance. I agreed with the prosecutor. She'd helped bring down men far more dangerous. For that, she lived. For that, I treated some elemental part of myself. People like tidy endings. They want the hero on a cliff, the villain in cuffs, the credits rolling over a city that breathes freer. That's not what happened. There were no cinematic confrontations. There were no last-minute confessions. There were depositions, and motions to suppress, and legalese that swaddle human actions in sterile semantics. The most dramatic thing that happened to me was to discover, in a file, an invoice marginally altered with my signature, a forgery, and the realization that for months I had been living in a version of truth I had allowed others to right for me. What I couldn't anticipate was the restless unraveling inside. I had the satisfaction of a ledger balanced, the kind a forensic accountant might love, but the cost, measured in small mercies lost, was immense. I no longer got the smile from construction inspectors who used to nod as I walked sites. People who used to call me for casual favors now spoke in a register that included lawyers. My name on the town's grapevine carried a weight that smelled like caution. There are moments, months later, when I walk by the river and think about choices I made, the revenge that became investigation, the investigation that became prosecution. Each act had a ripple. Some ripples smoothed things out, others eroded the banks beneath people's lives. I do not regret bringing them down. I regret the ugliness that accompanied the method. I regret the children who got pulled into the current, the colleagues who had to pack boxes. The small, quiet pleasures of ordinary trust that never recovered. In the end, what's left after the teeth is not a clean field. It is a scarred landscape with new growth here and there, saplings of compliance, fences of better governance, and inevitably, new shadows where the old system once fed. The hunger that led them to these crimes didn't vanish, it relocated. Where there was once a housestead, others waited in the wings. That's the bleakness of the work. You can break the visible nodes, and still the demand persists, looking for a new outlet. I tried for a while to teach what I knew. I set up workshops at local trade schools and community centers on corporate ethics, on how to read ledgers and ask uncomfortable questions. I lectured about procurement red flags and how small anomalies map to big problems. The students listened with that mixture of boredom and curiosity young people have for warnings. Maybe some of them will remember. Maybe one will ask questions where others would not. It felt like a small, useful thing to do with what remained of me. As winter folded into spring the year after the trials, I stood on the roof of my office building and watched the city breathe again. It was quieter now. We'd lost some contracts, gained new, cleaner ones. The men who'd run things before were in other places, or in cells or in portals of public shame. But the city's appetite for profit had not been quelled. I thought of Lauren sometimes, not with the sharpness of a man wanting answers anymore, but with the dull ache of an amputated limb. Sometimes I imagined her at a small kitchen table, in a town I'd never visit, making coffee, answering emails, living small and in hiding. The image didn't comfort me. It simply existed, like a photograph tucked into a book I opened sometimes. There are nights I still wake at 3:12 a.m., the old hour of ruined sleep. I sit on the edge of the bed, listening to the whir of the city beneath my window, and count the cost. You learn to accept that there are prices for truth. You also learn that some of those prices are paid to people who never asked to be collateral. If you ask me now whether I'd do it again, I'll give you the same answer I gave a reporter who once asked carefully in a cafe. Yes and no. Yes, because someone needed to show the ledger. No, because I would have tried harder to shield the people who got hurt in the process. I would have tried to be smaller with the wounds I opened. I would have tried to be kinder to the seams. Reckoning did not make me whole. It made the city a little cleaner and ruined a few more private lives in the process. The network's teeth were clipped, but not removed. New men with new appetites moved into the spaces we'd cleared. That is the cynic's truth. Systems adapt. But there was one other truth, quieter and kinder and more private. In a small envelope the prosecutor had given me, among photocopies and secure notes, there was a photograph, a hands-in-hand shot, 2 cups of coffee on a rickety table. A woman smiling, small and genuine, hair pulled back. On the back, in a looping handwriting, I still recognized a line, "Forgive me, if you can." I didn't burn the photo. I put it in a drawer and looked at it sometimes when the city felt too loud. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is a practical thing, a choice to stop waking at a certain hour and letting the quiet do what it must. It doesn't give you back what you lost. It simply stops the tally. I learned in the end that revenge and justice are different currencies. One spends you down, the other builds receipts. I spent a lot. I built some receipts. The ledgers balanced. The teeth were blunted. The seams of a system were opened so others could see their rot. And then I started teaching again, how to read numbers, how to ask uncomfortable questions, how to make small things matter. It felt like a small penance and a practical contribution. Maybe it will be enough to help one person notice a flinch, one small thing that keeps the next housestead from finding its seam on certain nights when the wind moves just right. I think I can hear the city settle, a sound like a deep breath. I don't pretend that it means everything is fixed. I only take it as a sign that something stopped getting worse. That for now is enough.